So I am really, really grateful that you have said yes to join us. So thank you very much. I'd like to introduce our guest, Professor Gus John, educator, author, social justice fighter and advocate, charismatic, pragmatic, a hard man to intimidate, a man who is known for getting stuck in there to actually make change happen, always willing to speak truth to power. Prof, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Marge.
Well, as I said, we are going to be spending some time finding out more about the things that have inspired you, that have guided you, and to find out something about the man behind whom so many look up to, look forward to, and who certainly, if I was in a fight, I want you right on my corner. So, as I said, thank you for joining us. But before we go into asking about the items in your Blakpak, I would just like to just say a little bit more and then ask you a much broader question. Now, I know that you were born on the beautiful island of Grenada in the Caribbean, in a small village called Concord. And for some people who visit Grenada, they may know Concord, not because they have family there, but because it has a rather wonderful waterfall and they may have visited that. Your parents were farmers, and as many of the parents of Caribbean children, they saw that education was, or they thought education was one of the means of actually moving us on and to do bigger and wider things. So you received a scholarship to Presentation College. It was one of these very well-known colleges in the Caribbean. There was equally a Presentation College in Trinidad. And from there, you went to study in Trinidad. And from Trinidad, you then continued your theological studies by coming to the University of Oxford in the UK. I'm not going to go much further except to say, and then things really started. And the Gus John that many of us know today started at that point from a UK base. So, Prof, if you wouldn't mind me calling you Prof. So, Prof, what I'd
Gus
like
would
is...
do very well. Gus would do excellently.
So, Gus, I would like you to just share with us from that beginning in the village of Concord to the 60s and beyond. And as I said, the person we know today, can you just give us some insight, the motivation? What was it that was put there that have created the person we are seeing in front of us now?
Well, thank you, Marge, and thank you, William. Thank you all for your introduction. Before I say anything else, let me greet and pay respects to an elder in the room, Elder Eric Huntley, who is probably the oldest person in the room and has been a major influence in my own life and my journey ever since the 1960s. Welcome, Elder Eric Huntley. To begin at the beginning, so to say, so I was born into a very poor family in that glorious village of Concord. Most people in the village were either functionally illiterate or semi-literate, including my parents. My father was totally illiterate, but a very wise man. And I learned a great deal from him. They were both peasant farmers. He did other things. He was a stonemason. He felled trees and made boards in the forest and so on. But a very wise man. And I've always reflected upon what he might have been if he had not been denied schooling and education. And one of the things he gave me really is an appreciation of politics. Grenada, like every other Caribbean island, had been through a massive political unrest as people fought for bread, for justice, for freedom from the plantation system and all its ravages. He had been to Aruba to work in the oil fields of Aruba, refining oil with the Lago Dutch Oil Company. He'd worked in the oil fields of South Trinidad and all of that before I was born. Um, so he learned a lot and knew a lot about how Grenada came to be as it was. What was its history? I mean, we weren't Caribs, we weren't Amerindians, we weren't Arawaks. We were African people transported there in shackles and left there to make a new society and indeed to fend for ourselves, both under colonialism and after. So at the age of 6, I remember my father and other men, typically from the village, going around and burning sugar plantations, burning down the houses of plantation owners, because for too long the population had been starved of proper wages, working conditions, and so on. And he helped me to understand why it is that they were destroying the very plantations that gave them jobs. Um, and he had an internationalist perspective because although he couldn't read and write, I remember as a child, and indeed up until the time he left Grenada to come to England in 1957, his constant companion was a Pi radio. Now, there perhaps are many people in the room who don't remember Pi radios, but they were a fixture. My father had it with him at all times, including when he went to bed. And he listened to the BBC World Service. And he knew what was going on outside of Grenada, particularly in Africa. So he could tell me a lot about Patrice Lumumba. He could tell me a lot about the apartheid regime in South Africa. He could tell me a lot about a whole range of things. And that was very meaningful. And it was, in fact, his education for me on current affairs, political affairs, social affairs, was greater in magnitude and in quality than anything I learned at the prestigious Presentation College, for example. So it is in relation to all of that and in consideration of all of that that I developed a real sense of what colonialism was about, the relationship between racism and capitalism, the relationship between racism and a lack of social justice. And I could see it unfolding around me. We had our own brand of racism in the society, in that people who were what I call caramel colored, in other words, a mixture of European and African, had many more opportunities than people like me who was all African. And even though you went to the same school for 8 years, 11 years, or whatever it is, you could guarantee if you're an African school leaver that you would have less opportunities to join the civil service, to work in banks, etc., than those who were so-called mulatto. And you could see that playing out. So the business about lack of access to opportunity, not based upon your capacity, but upon other extraneous factors, the barriers that you put in your way, we lived through all of that. And having to survive on pretty much nothing every week except what you grew in your own land was a very humbling experience. Fortunately, as you said, Marge, I won a scholarship and was able to go to Presentation College because my parents wouldn't have been able to afford to send me there. And one of the things I reflected upon regularly on my frequent visits to Grenada, I used to go there at least once a year when my parents were still alive, was the number of my classmates, from primary school who never had the opportunity to go to secondary school, who remained in that village languishing, getting occasional jobs, doing whatever it is, crop picking or working in lands and so on and so forth, but who who killed themselves really by overconsumption of alcohol, um, and many of them were a downside brighter than I was, and I just thought it was shameful that one's potential and potential in life was so limited on account of poverty. So I developed a sense of social justice pretty early as a result of all of those experiences and the way that my parents actually dealt with them. So I left Grenada, went to Trinidad, joined a seminary of all places at a pretty tender age, um, and became more and more disgruntled with the Roman Catholic Church for two reasons. One, because even when I was in Grenada, I was an altar boy from the age of 5. I mean, my mother was more Roman Catholic than the Virgin Mary. Um, so I was an altar boy from a very early age. And therefore, I heard lots of sermons, um, uh, compounded foolishness, frankly, from these damn priests. Um, and worse than that, the Roman Catholic priests and the Anglican priests, they knew one another. They met and shared all sorts of knowledge about the local population and so on. Um, and they of course were very close to the planters, so they would go for elaborate dinner parties, etc., in the planters' homes and so forth. And then they would come into church the following Sunday and preach rubbish to the population about praedial larceny, people thieving some yams or some breadfruit or whatever to go and feed their families. And in spite of the fact that those wretches were paying them next to nothing, they didn't expect, they frowned upon their uh, liberating food from the land to go and feed the families. So it was a very distorted, contaminated kind of gospel that those people preached, and it was a gospel according to Arthur the planter rather than according to Mark the apostle, and that sort of thing went on all the time. So for those reasons, I had my problems with the Roman Catholic Church. But when I started training for the priesthood and got a sense of how Rome operated, how the Pope gave sanction to many tyrannical leaders in these totalitarian states, Salazar in Portugal, Franco in Spain, and so on and so forth. I just thought that there was something really quite toxic about that particular religion, and at Oxford it became compounded, of course, because I got a sense of how the Dominican order operated in South Africa under the apartheid system. We had two Dominican houses out there in Stellenbosch and Witwatersrand. Um, and generally speaking, it was clear that the church did not want to put itself on the line when it came to defending those people in townships and so on. So an accumulation of all of that led me to feel that whatever other aspirations I had, and whether I believed I had a calling from God or not, I could not exist within the Roman Catholic Church. So for other reasons too, I joined a Christian Marxist group in Oxford, uh, became a Marxist, jumped out of the cloth, and started doing work on combating racism in Oxford schools, joined CARD, the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, in London, and got my dispensation from my holy vows, holy orders from Rome, and sped out of the monastery.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gus. That was really insightful, an awful lot there. And it's actually quite wonderful to hear, because I want to now, I'm going to ask you in about 2 minutes for your first item. But before that, one other question, because we know you so much for your whole, a lot of work you have done on education, you continue to do, and that passion. So I'm understanding better about, where you're saying you're coming from with your family. Anything to help us with the jump then from, Oxford, and where you have really centered so much of what you do, even your most recent, where you're the co-founder of Community
Empowerment Network.
Yes, and that
Yes.
that network. Something there, something about the what is it that made that seem to be such an important part of your life journey?
Well, again, that started in Oxford. Um, so I was a Dominican friar at Blackfriars in St. Giles, um, but very grounded within the Black community in East Oxford. Um, there was a car plant in Oxford making Morris and Austin cars, and some of us might be old enough to remember the spanking Austin Cambridge and the Morris Oxford and such wonderful vehicles. The men typically from various Caribbean islands worked in the car factories, and the women worked at the two university teaching hospitals, the Radcliffe and the Churchill. Their children went to Oxford schools. And as Steve McQueen's film Subnormal recently demonstrated, many of them were coming in that time to join parents having been left behind in the Caribbean for a varying number of years while the parents settled down in England. And the parents looked to me for some guidance as to how they should deal with those schools, because so many of the children were being put into schools for the educationally subnormal or being thought of as imbeciles or whatever else it may be. So even in my monks, my friars' robes, I was going into schools and taking on head teachers, etc., because of the way they were treating those kids. And the ones who were treated the worst were Jamaican children, because everybody thought they were talking a language which couldn't possibly be derived from English. The teachers were scared of Black kids. They didn't understand them. Their schooling hadn't equipped them with any information about the background of children in the Caribbean or about the Caribbean schooling system. So the general attitude was that we were all benighted, illiterate. The only experience we had was walking behind cows and so on. And so children's educational potential was being denied and trampled upon by that schooling system. So even then, I was taking on schools and particularly getting teachers to understand that there's a variety of languages in the Caribbean. Although the foundation might be English, Barbadian was not Jamaican, Trinidadian English was not Grenadian English. St. Lucia had both English and French as the medium teaching in schools. And so they had to begin to treat those children with respect. But then what I discovered soon afterwards, and indeed for a couple of decades later, was that the teachers were being taught a whole lot of stuff to do with eugenics and biological racism, basically, in relation to the intelligence that children had or did not have on account of their race. So I got more embroiled in dealing with those issues than I did in learning about Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine and those wonderful people.
Thank God for that. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, well, let's now enter into your Blakpak. And as we know, you're going to share it as 4 items. So I'm going to ask you, Gus, for the first item, what would you like to share to pull out of your Blakpak to share with us and give us some sort of background as to why?
Well, we've been talking about education. I suppose most people know me as having a background in education. As a consequence of all that I was sharing with you about my early schooling and how schooling was organized in Grenada, I had a particular perspective on what I call children's education rights. And that's even before I became acquainted with the United Nations Charter on the Rights of the Child, Convention on the Rights of the Child. Um, but the one person, academic, education activist that inspired me more than any other throughout my life, frankly, was Paulo Freire. And the book that I have in my pack is this book, A Pedagogy for Liberation, by Ira Shaw and Paulo Freire. It is a fantastic book, which frankly I hope every teacher in the country has read, even if they might debunk it after they've read it, because it really does explain for me how education is structured in societies such as the Caribbean, in societies like Britain, where the class system determines what the education system should be, and what therefore the responsibility not just of teachers but of parents is in relation to all of that. If I might just share a couple of tremendous sayings of, of Paulo Freire. He reminds us that education does not shape society. Society shapes education according to the interests of those in power. And we've had endless experiences of that in this country, where you have benighted characters like Michael Gove, of all people, trying to determine what should be taught, not just to Black children, but to all children in British schools, where you have a schooling system that grades children according to tests that they sit, exams and aptitude tests and so forth, as distinct from how they learn and what they could demonstrate as a result of how they learn. So the whole thing is structured, it's contained, it is meant to create the results that the ruling class actually wants. Freire famously said, education does not change society. Education changes people. People change society. And therefore, if you want to change society, you've got to do something about the kind of education you give to children. And if you orient them in a particular manner to have aspirations towards whatever it may be, which doesn't have to do with their own, the liberation of their minds and the upliftment of their own communities, then the education to them could be pretty much useless. Because what that doesn't take into account, and let's leave race and what have you out of it for the minute. I could never understand why it is that people believed that before we came here, Britain was totally monoracial or monocultural. I mean, there was a program done on BBC, whatever it is, some while ago. Who do you think you are? And some white people, I'm sure, had nervous breakdowns when they discovered that they had lots of Black genes running around in them. Yeah. So, and similarly, the ruling classes organized formal schooling and education in the country. They had charitable organizations that was responsible for schooling. Where we came from, they determined who should be taught and who shouldn't be taught. And the conveyor of education was frankly the church. And to this day, the Roman Catholic Church in Trinidad, Grenada, St. Lucia, etc., exerts more influence on education content, curriculum, structure than anything else. So it's a phenomenally liberating book, and it helps to liberate people's minds. And as far as I'm concerned, it is, whether we're talking about post-16 education, early years education through to university, it is one of the most important books, I think, that there is. Uh, uh, um, its twin, of course, is Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which people know much better than a Pedagogy for Liberation.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. We'll probably put that in, not probably, put that in the chat a little later on for
Sure.
those people who want to take it down. Thank you so much for that. So, well, it's time to go to your next item, next of your 4 items that you would like to share with us.
Well, I mean, my next item really comes from, again, my early experience as a boy growing up both in Grenada and in Trinidad before coming to Britain. Um, Before I went to presentation college, I only wear shoes to church, to funerals, and to weddings. And the expectation, particularly for poor parents like mine, was that because you didn't wear the shoes regularly, they would last you a long time. I mean, leather shoes weren't cheap, right? Um, so when I went to presentation college and I was required to wear shoes every day, it was a big deal, because the shoes that I had going to church, leaving the church, taking them off, tying them around my neck, and walking on the tarmac with the stuff burning my feet. Those shoes were frankly too small. The the shoes remained new, but my feet grew. So the first day I went to school, I was in agony. And of course, when your shoes are hurting, you walk funny, right? It's natural. And I was being teased a lot, particularly by the boys who lived in town, whose parents were rich, and some of them came to school at the age of 16 in cars, for God's sake. All right. I had to ride a bus 9 miles into the town and 9 miles back every day because my parents couldn't afford for me to board in the town. Okay. And so they would come wrapping you around the head and all sorts of stuff. And I had to learn to fight, because I made a decision even then that I would not allow poverty to assault me. Nor would I allow those people to feel that because I was a black boy from country, they could take liberties with me. So I had to deal with some of them to teach them some respect. Okay. And then there were other things as well. Some teachers who were just as vile as some of the students in their attitudes towards children of peasant workers and so on. And I made a pledge then. I refined it as time went on. The pledge is in 2 parts. One, do not let where you came from determine how far you could go. And don't let anybody put obstacles in your way because of where you came from. And 2, let no one, let no circumstance, let nothing, not even your own timid self, render you less than you are or less than you know you have the capacity to be. Okay, so that for me dealt with all that rubbish about class and color and nonsense in the Caribbean. But it was even more instrumental and powerful when I came to this country, because for me, it was a defense, a bulwark against racism. Let no one render you less than you are, whether it be because of the color of your skin, the way you speak, how you have sex, or whatever else it may be. And so those have been, I mean, okay, some people think I'm feisty, right? I make no apologies for that. The message I send out to people is, don't mess with me. Because if you want to fight, you can begin to try and mess with me. Whether you're a vice chancellor, the leader of a council, I can tell you the joy I had in Hackney when I was the director of education with these counselors there. And once you liberate your mind and you're very clear as to where you're going and what your own self-worth is, you develop the strength not to let anybody dent that. And that has kept me going. So I'm not looking to the establishment or the system for accolades of any kind. When they offered me a CBE, whatever it's called, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, I told Tony Blair to stuff it. And that is making a statement. You don't dump upon me and my people from a great height and then want to come and give me some accolade because, oh, you've done a lot for race relations or whatever it is. I don't need your validation. What I need you is to get your jackboot off my neck. So don't tell me to come to the palace for some damn CBE or OBE or MBE or whatever other BE it is. Do something about the injustices that you're heaping upon people, which is why I was irate. And I mean, I think the whole world knows it. I was irate when these people were flocking in the dandan to Westminster Abbey to give thanks for the contribution we've made to Britain over 60 or 70 years since 1948 and the Windrush, and then going to have tea and cucumber sandwiches with Theresa May at Downing Street at the same time that the woman was killing our elders, denying them medicines, having lived here and worked here and contributed to Britain for more than 40 years, or sending them back to the Caribbean to die. Now, why should these people not do worse to us if we demonstrate to them that it doesn't matter what they do, we still flock around looking for their validation and going and praying with them for God's sake?
Thank you very much for that second item and the background to that. And I could now understand an awful lot better when I heard someone said of you, I think something about reminding them of a street fighter. And I had that picture when you were speaking at this particular time. And I'm not quite sure how you didn't laugh even at some of your own stories, Gus. When you talked about the shoe and your foot on the hot tarmac, and so on, I don't know. I suspect that our audience must have been having a good, but it does help us to understand some of, where all of that energy. And again, as I said, you are very adept at that balance of being the street fighter, but fighting strongly on our behalf, but also being someone that people can come to knowing that they can trust to fight their corner and to help them. So thank you very much for that. And again, the two sayings, as you said, they're Gus sayings that you have morphed over the years and formed into two beautiful sayings that we'll again share later on. So street fighter, but at the same time, often a glove of velvet. Let's have your third item.
Well, I mean, the third item I think is this, and it relates to the second one. I have heard too many teachers and head teachers, and particularly careers officers, talking about Black young people, Black males in particular, as not having high aspirations. They're not aiming high enough. And my retort to that is that for you to have high aspirations, you must have some confidence that there are opportunities for you to realize those aspirations. Aspirations without opportunities are really dreams, and some of them become pipe dreams, really. So I have a little model here which I developed some while ago, and it follows the letter. Well, when I was learning my alphabet, and I hope that's true for everybody, we were assisted in distinguishing between vowels and consonants, right? And the vowels are A, E, I, O, U, and each of those represents something in my third uh, uh, pack item. So A, aspiration. They need to have high aspirations, but also to make sure that they're the right ones. Um, I mean, if any mentee of mine or any child of mine were to come to me and say, I have an aspiration to be in Boris Johnson's cabinet, I'll chase them. All right. I'll tell them, go back and seek some wisdom from somewhere. So you have to make sure your aspirations are the right ones. It shouldn't be to follow Bezos and what's the fellow's name? The Virgin Man, and go up to space while two-thirds of the world are hungry and dying. Okay. Have high aspirations. E is for effort, disciplined effort to match and even surpass your high aspirations. Um, and I have to stress the discipline bit of it, because if there's one thing I was inspired by from my poor, hardworking parents, was the discipline they brought to what they did. And they demonstrated why that was so important in terms of the outcomes that they wanted. So disciplined effort. The third is initiative. AEI, take initiative and take responsibility for taking initiative, open doors, and kick down barriers. The O in AEIOU is for opportunity. As I said before, aspirations without opportunities remain dreams. So one's got to grab opportunities, particularly in this racist society, and create them. As an academic, one of the things I'm increasingly alarmed about is the growing tendency within the HE, higher education sector, to establish league tables of one sort or another. The latest league table they've been talking about is identifying universities, grading universities on the basis of their success, the success of their graduates in finding jobs after graduation. Now, if you have that as a metric, you must have some notion of a level playing field. Yeah. So if you have racism within the society, if you have people putting up barriers in the path of very able Black graduates, barriers which have nothing at all to do with their capacity, their potential, their qualifications, but to do with other extraneous factors. You don't like the look of them, you don't like the name, or whatever else it may be, then it is stupid to suggest that you should choose a university based upon how quickly the graduates get employment, when you don't do something about the fact that Black graduates cannot get employment as quickly as everybody else. Right. So grab opportunities, create opportunities, kick down barriers. And the third one, AEIOU, is be unrelenting in the assertion of your rights and your pursuit of justice. Unrelenting. And do not lose your way. don't lose your way in the sense that you end up with a doctorate, but then you go and do and write foolishness like Tony Sewell. How is it possible for a black man of all people to go and write that kind of gibberish and confirm for uh, Boris Johnson and his lot that they are right when they say everything has got better, there are no racial disparities, blah, 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 blah. We have a responsibility. And the black intellectual, public intellectual, academic intellectual, whatever, we carry a major responsibility, especially at times like these. And it is a responsibility that I don't think this fellow understands. And I'm being personal about it because he wrote the damn thing. You know what I mean? And he should know better. And those who know better should do better. So we have a debate. We must have a debate. In 1962 or whenever it was, that wonderful man, Harold Cruz, God rest his soul, wrote a book called The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. Okay, there were all kinds of things with that I had some problems. But he was raising some major issues. What is the role of black intellectuals in the context of the struggles that we have and the way in which we are positioned within societies and education systems such as this? So, unrelenting in the assertion of your rights and your pursuit of justice, unrelenting in calling out those people who have a veneer of believing in equality and racial justice and inclusion and the rest of it, but at the same time want to incorporate us into the systems so that we can validate what they're doing as they screw us to the wall.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Now, I know there are so many questions I want to put, but I'm very mindful of time. And I'm going to say that we're coming to the last item very soon. So audience, please, if there are any questions that you'd like to ask, we'll have a little bit of a Q&A at the end. And then afterwards, we stay on for the bit of the afterglow. But there's so much being said, and I know that there's so many, but I want to just press on so that we can get as much as we can. But something struck me, though, Gus, with what you just said now and previously, you know, about responsibility, about, you know, stepping up to the plate, as it were. And also about if, you know, someone you knew well decided to come and tell you they're going to go and work in Boris and his cabinet or in his front room or wherever. Now, I do recall that at one time, did you not do some work with the, you know, was it when Boris was mayor? But you also spent some time working and being advisor to Jack Straw in the early government of Tony Blair. Can you give us a few thoughts on that? Just a few thoughts, because I still need to come to your next item.
Yes, I after Labour came out of the wilderness in 1997, having been there as a result of 18 years of Thatcherism, I was asked to be an advisor to Jack Straw on race and social inclusion. And there were a few of us, including Roz Howells, Herman Ousley, and the late Lincoln Crawford, and a couple more. And I mean, that was an interesting experience in the sense that Jack Straw seemed committed to doing something about race. Our argument was that race had to be put much more centrally into policy making by the Labour government, that they had to take account of all that had happened before and the complicity in it, particularly immigration legislation and so on, and that something had to be done to make sure that the requirements of the 1976 Race Relations Act were actually being complied with. So we held his toes to the fire successfully, I believe, because a combination of his own personal um, 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 interest and the pressure put on them by Nelson Mandela when he visited this place was what led to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry that Macpherson conducted, and so forth. Um, the one thing I was concerned about there was that um, while we were in that whole period when we were advising Straw, there were calls for uh, a Holocaust Memorial Day, and that was discussed interminably within the Race Relations Forum, which Jack Straw chaired. We were arguing that it was totally proper that there should be a Holocaust Memorial Day, but that Britain had a historical responsibility, not just for its past, but for its contemporary activities in the Caribbean and Africa, especially after it had joined the European Club and become part of the European Union or European Economic Community and so on and so forth. And therefore, if it was going to establish a Holocaust Memorial Day for the 1940s Holocaust of Jewish people, it had to determine what it would do in relation to the 200 million Africans and indigenous peoples from across the world that it had displaced by genocide and barbarism. He sent Lincoln Crawford and a few people away to do some feasibility study or whatever to look at the whole business of slavery memorial. And that simply petered out. It came to nothing. But within 1 year of Straw determining that they were going to support the Holocaust Memorial Day, there were these massive events taking place. The first one was in London, massive event at Westminster Central Hall, and then in other parts of the country every year thereafter. More recently, the government has, as you know, have recently determined that they would allow a Jewish memorial in Westminster, just near the Houses of Parliament. Some people who were planning a slavery memorial asked the government for £4 million towards that project. The government said it had no money, but it could find £75 million for the Jewish memorial. And as I was saying to Jack Straw even then, it would appear that the government responds to those who shout the loudest, even though its responsibility to African people is arguably more immediate, more extensive than its responsibility. I'm not aware that Britain assisted Hitler in the industrial extermination of 6 million Jews. I am aware of what Britain did over God knows how many decades in relation to enslaved Africans, both there and on the plantations of the Caribbean and in the Americas and so on. And that brings me to another point. I mean, when I talk about, not joining Johnson's cabinet and so forth, which is that
I'm going to have to butt in and say, make this a short one because I still need your last item in a minute, and we've got lots of questions coming up. So okay. Yeah.
Which is that we have to understand that the British state didn't have to go down the road that it went down after the Second World War. It didn't have to pass these immigration laws, etc., and treat us as if we're invading aliens that they'd not seen before and didn't know how to deal with. And so that ought to set an agenda for us now as Black people in this society, who are no longer strangers. We're not migrant workers. We are a settled African community in Britain, and we've made this place home to a whole 2, 3, 4 generations of people like ourselves. That places a particular responsibility upon us to determine what our relationship to the state is going to be and what future we would help our children carve out in this society. We haven't even begun yet to rise to that particular task.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so now it's for the last item.
Well, my last item really was going to be about Haiti, uh, but we don't have time to go into that in any great detail. I just want to say, if one part of the world epitomizes the barbarism, the hypocrisy, the hubris of these Western nations, including the United States, that beleaguered country, Haiti, is it. And when we consider that it still is it's at the zenith, if you like, of Black resistance to enslavement and colonization and the plantation system, in that whole period, since the 18th century. It is amazing to think that it remains so isolated, even in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that Caribbean countries, CARICOM and all of those countries that constitute CARICOM, have got a position on Haiti, and on Haiti belonging to their company, to that body of nation states, and therefore them having to take up the gauntlet in relation to the liberation of that society and the way in which it is constantly being damaged and destroyed by interests such as France and the United States.
So therefore, are you saying that in terms of your last item, it's just the lessons we learn from there, or
the lessons we learned from there, and the agenda really, to work towards the one Caribbean that Maurice Bishop particularly was committed to, and gave his life for, so that we begin to understand, especially with climate change and all of those natural disasters and stuff happening more regularly, those places cannot have a future unless they see the future being combined, and each one being dependent upon the other.
Right.
This nonsense of Jamaica talking about 9 million, whatever, or billion, whatever it is, that it wants in reparations from Britain is a complete nonsense. You can't say, it's like the West Indies Federation. The same foolishness went on then. You can't say we as Jamaica are going to plow our own furrow and have a claim for reparations from Britain, irrespective of what happens to St. Lucia or Dominica or Trinidad or Grenada or whatever else. It simply does not make sense. And those islands continue to be ripped off and picked off by Europe, by Britain, by whosoever, by Russia, by China, whoever. And they have to understand that the future lies in consolidating and becoming one Caribbean, looking at their respective economic, social, cultural, political interests, and seeing themselves. I mean, we all know that we became a Caribbean people in Britain before we came here in the 1950s and 60s and so forth. We hardly knew about our neighbors in the Caribbean. No Jamaicans came to Grenada, as far as I can remember, and few of us, apart from going to the University of the West Indies, few of us actually went to Jamaica for any reason. So that separation, that insularity, um, has meant a lot in terms of the rate of our lack of progress, and the manner in which we have not been a unified voice in making demands on Britain and on Europe.
Prof, I know you say Gus is enough to call you that, but Prof Gus, you've said so many things. You've told us so many things. I mean, so we are very, very well pleased to find out about the motivation and those factors that you want to share. You've talked about the sayings that out of life you have carved out these strong sayings about not being held back by where we come from, not allowing anyone to, as it were, steal our power and hold us back and tell us what we cannot do. You've talked to us very much about the oneness of the Caribbean. You've reminded us very much about the what we owe as people, as individuals, and as you were saying also very much about the academics, those who have the power to actually stand up and to make a difference. And we thank you for all of those factors and the things that you have shared, because, as I'm saying to those who've joined us again today, what we are about in the interview is really trying to glean the motivation and those things that have helped yourself, the giants whose shoulders we stand on, to allow us to actually be motivated, be inspired, to say thank you and to learn. Now, we have actually gone over our time. I have seen, though, that those who started are still with us. So I'm going to actually say, I beg your indulgence, because I'm going to want to go straight on to say, please let us answer some of your questions. So, we cannot have come this far. I must admit, I did suspect that we would overrun, because I knew that we wanted to hear you and hear more. And there's more we could ask. So I'm saying, I'm begging your indulgence, stay with us. When I look outside, if you're in London, it's a bit gloomy. The person who's from far overseas, whether it's, I can't remember if it's the west coast of the USA, it's probably a different weather there. Stay with us so that we can ask some more questions and hear some more about the things that have been an inspiration. Gus, I'm going to ask you to really shorten this answer, and then I'm going to go to questions. Out of all the things that you have said and the things you haven't said, if I squeeze you to the wall, and you're not a person I think I can squeeze to the wall, okay? So it's a metaphorical squeeze. What one point would you like to say, I want to give this to the next generation? I think it's a hard one. I want to give this to the next generation. What might it be?
That we have as much right to determine and shape the future of this society as anybody else. Mm-hmm. That we should demand that people don't see us as second generation this or third generation that or whatever, and call us BAME. And that systems and structures are put in place where we are taken into the reckoning when government wants to make any law or pass any policies or statutory guidelines, etc., that affect us. Now, we can say that, but in order to do it, we must work together, all of us, and put in place the structures that could underpin that and make it happen. Because there is a lot of dissembling going on all around the place, and people make choices, and it's a free country. People could decide what they do, including MBs and OBs and the rest of it. That's a personal choice. My point is that the people could only keep doing things to you if you let them, all right? And we are letting the British state, the nation state of Britain, do us too many wrong and barbaric things. And I can't for the life of me understand why we sit back and allow this hostile environment thing to go on. Plane loads of people leaving and being taken off to Jamaica and so on and so forth. We don't seem to protest about it, or not enough at any rate. Mm-hmm. So we need a national body representing the interests of African diaspora people in this country, particularly our children and our grandchildren, and ensuring that whoever it is has to take us into the reckoning. If we make the mistake of believing that because Don Butler, David Lammy, Diane Abbott, or whoever else they are there, and therefore they're taking care of business on our behalf, then we would continue to be screwed to the wall. Because that whole system is part of the state. It is not acting in our interest. We need to reclaim that power, demonstrate that power, and remember that in relation to that horrendous fire on the 18th of January, 1981 at New Cross, we demonstrated our presence and our power in this country by bringing 25,000 people onto the streets of London on an ordinary Monday. We need to understand where that came from, what it meant, and capitalize on that movement that it actually represented. If there's one thing that I hope to see before I pop my clogs, and I intend to be around for a hell of a long time more, I have to tell you. But if there's one thing I want to see, is a powerful organization such as this to hold the nation state of Britain to account.
Thank you very, very much. And I too hope you're not about to pop your clogs and that you will be able to see that day come. I hope prophetically that you'll be able to see it. Now, one of the decisions I've taken is that we have a lot of questions, and there are a number of questions, but we have overstayed our time. So what I'm going to do is to, in a sense, bring our time together to say thank you so much. We have been enlightened. I've learned an awful lot, and there's so much. And it's just to sit, to listen, to hear the wisdom, to hear the pointers, speaking to us from your perspective. I am just saying thank you. And it has been our benefit and our blessing that you've come to speak with us. But because of time, I'm going to formally close this session, not to say don't go yet, anybody. I'm going to formally close the recording session and say thank you very much. And I'm also going to say that as Blakpak, we're going to take a break for the next 2 months, and we're going to come back in October with our critical conversation. But we are just grateful for Professor Gus John being with us. And what we're going to go now is to ask for the recording to be stopped and for us to continue. But this time around, if you wish to stay, we will take your questions and we'll ask them. And some of you will have the chance to ask it yourself without even putting it in the chat, because I know that Gus is willing to stay with us a bit longer so we can have this after chat. So I'm just formally rounding up. Okay, recording has stopped. So I'm saying thank you so much. So those